I'm Anna Maria Lachimi. I'm professor of law and development at the University of Nottingham, and I'm a co-I to the network. I lead on the law element of the network, and I'm delighted to welcome you today and to be joined by so many friends and distinguished colleagues. This workshop gives us the opportunity to interrogate the nexus between law and marine cultural heritage. And together today, we will explore some of the multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary aspects of the Rising from the Dead network as they relate to law and marine cultural heritage. In particular, we want to explore the role that international and national law plays in supporting and realizing the potential of marine cultural heritage within the context of sustainable development in East Africa. And we do this to understand in which way law in its materiality affects, conditions, helps protecting and promoting marine cultural heritage, and in turn, how the way law interacts with marine cultural heritage affects the development context. And importantly, also the workshop offers us one of the very first opportunity that we have had to take stock of some of the legal results of the projects that have been financed by the Rising from the Dead network. And this project really illustrates the gap and the deficiency in marine cultural heritage preservation and in community involvement of the current legal mechanism that exists at the national and at the international level. And it's quite exciting, really, because this is the first time that we have together the law element of the network. So finally, we can really exchange views and even see how the work done by the many projects interacts and links with each other. I have to say that while some projects are finished, others, for instance, those of the PhD students, are still, are still continuing because they are linked and related to the network, but they're not tied to the same boundaries of projects specifically financed by the network, because the PhDs are financed by the institutions instead, but they're very much linked to the network. And they do fit within the theme of the capacity building that we wanted to develop with the network. And it's very rare to have PhD students specific, especially within law, to have PhD students specific on issues that relate to East Africa and involving students specifically from East Africa. So it's we shouldn't underestimate how important this is, because it's an issue of resources, and resources are very limited in this respect, in this context, especially nowadays in general with PhD scholarships. So I will keep it very brief, but I just want to say a couple of things about the objectives that we initially set up. When we initially set up the network, we were especially concerned with the links between marine cultural heritage and development aid. Our underpinning assumptions were that knowledge of the past can inform development aid policies, modern development projects, and coastal management strategies. So we wanted to understand how marine cultural heritage could help further a vision of development that was closer to the people, their histories, their culture. And you've read this in one of the main papers that we have published, but we soon realized that the discourse and the implications of looking at law and development and cultural heritage were way broader than what we initially were set out to explore. And there were considerable gaps in the literature in both understanding the linkages between law and cultural heritage and the implications that these have for development. And as we have already said before, while there was considerable literature on investment law and the interaction with human rights and how cultural heritage could be protected. A lot of work has been done, certainly on the UN Convention on Cultural Heritage and then the Underwater Convention. There were still some considerable gaps, more in terms of looking at international law in its complexity. And if I think about the work that we have done and the projects that we have financed, including the PhD scholarships that we have supported and we have helped to fund and to create, I could say that our work has really led us in many directions. First, we looked at the complexity of law, national and international, what gaps persist, what contradictions emerged. And most importantly, we have realized that a deeper understanding of marine cultural heritage has helped us understand the linkages, but also the gaps that still exist, and sadly too often the protection that the law affords is only performative. And there continue to exist too many gaps between the commitment made at the UN level and the actual work done at the ground level by donors and by governments, by companies. And we will see today in the first part of this workshop, thanks to the presentation by Daria Daviti and Mario Azzar, we will explore what these broader linkages of international law are. So this is where this first part of the seminar is mainly focused on. And then another focus of our work has been to look at the role the marine cultural heritage can play within the context of the right to development. And so because the right to development is a participatory right, a right to participate to the process of development, marine cultural heritage can help us understand who are the actors of development, those to be involved in the development process. And it can guide us to identify what meaningful participation means for them. So in this respect, the legal notion of free, prior, and informed consent are important in this respect because they can help us identify this. And this has a very practical implication as well, because the aid projects that are financed by development actors require this involvement and this participation. So in the second part, we will explore a little bit more this concept, especially with Joshua presentation. And finally, let me just highlight the importance of the case studies, because the case studies have allowed us to consider the situation in a specific country, to understand how the law operates in practice, grounded in the realities that people experience every day and the obstacles that they encounter from a legal perspective. So, and this has allowed us to see how the international becomes national, or to use the words of a dear friends of ours, how the global meets the local. So I think that this is quite important, and I truly look forward to hear the presentations about the case studies. That we have. But now, without any further ado, let me hand the floor to Professor Mariano Aznar for his presentation on marine cultural heritage communities and international law. Professor Mariano Aznar is Professor of Public International Law at the University Jaume I, Spain, counsel and legal expert for Spain and other states and the UNESCO on law of the sea. He is member of the International Committee for Underwater Cultural Heritage at ICOMOS and academician of the Spanish Royal Academy Academy of the Sea and consulting scholar at Penn University Cultural Heritage Center. The floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria, and thank you, of course, to all the organizers for inviting me to share with you somehow a theoretical approach to the question and focusing on some particular points that have been posed by the 2001 UNESCO Convention. Let me share my I don't know if you can see it. Okay, so the main ideas I would like to share with you is as follows. If we are talking about the international legal protection of the underwater cultural heritage, we must realize that notwithstanding the will that the UNESCO Convention may be the so far best international legal regime for protecting this heritage, so far, or right now, the general regime is that provided by the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea, adopted in 1982. And the problem is that, as you may know, this convention of more than 300 articles refers to the underwater cultural heritage just in 2 articles. The latest one, which is the 303, it's more general and does apply to all marine zones created by UNCLOS. And in this article, there is no single reference to local communities and their possible involvement in the management or protection of coastal or marine or underwater cultural heritage. The only possible mention, and I have serious doubts that this article could be interpreted in this sense, would be the other article in UNCLOS referring to archaeological and historical objects, which is Article 149, which talks in a very complex drafting, which actually is due to a mistake on the drafting, talks that the underwater cultural heritage will be preserved or dispersed for the benefit of mankind as a whole, and that particular regard will be paid to preferential rights. And then it says, of the state or country of origin, I will focus on this, country of origin, or the state of cultural origin, or the state of historical and archaeological origin. With this phrasing, it was the rationale of this complex phrasing was to give some flaw to the fact that current states that not necessarily encapsulates unifying peoples or single different original cultures. And then this is why the terms state and countries of origin or cultural origin are mixed. In any case, I give not too much flaw to this article in providing some kind of legal guidance on the protection of cultural heritage to communities, because this article is in the part related to the area, that is the maritime zone beyond the national jurisdiction of any state. So it's the high seas and all these enormous area, which has been otherwise declared common heritage of humanity. So to summarize, UNCLOS does not provide good possible regulation for these management or protection of underwater cultural heritage in terms of involvement of communities. It is true that the 2001 UNESCO Convention does include some references to these local communities, but I would like to discuss with you in particular 3 points that I think could give some room to these involvement of the communities in the protection of the underwater cultural heritage. One is through the rules in the convention protecting venerated places. The second could be byproduct of the in situ protection rule as a first option. And third, the general approach the 2001 convention makes about jurisdictional problems and its neutrality with regard these questions of national jurisdictions. If we focus on the protection of venerated places, we will find that in Article 2, paragraph 9, that is within the general introduction to the convention and its objectives and general principles of the convention, it said that state parties shall ensure that proper respect is given to all human remains located in maritime waters. It is particularly interesting to know a little bit about the drafting of this article, because initially it was proposed by naval powers to protect just and only the maritime war graves. And then negotiating states like the UK, like Spain, like Portugal, also, although participated as not as a state member to UNESCO, the United States, and some other former and current naval powers were eager to give under the convention a specific protection to maritime war graves. Immediately, there was a reaction of the delegations of the so-called Third World among the negotiating states at UNESCO, saying, and why only maritime war graves? This is your human remains. That is the human remains of in underwater archaeological sites of the great maritime powers. But there is a lot of human remains that are underwater that deserve a legal protection, and therefore we must not limit this kind of protection to maritime war graves. And for example, there was a very, very eventually fruitful pression from the African delegations saying, what about the slave ships that wrecked in some moment? These human remains also deserve the legal protection and are not protected as maritime war graves. And then the immediate reaction of naval powers was, of course, to admit that they must agree with a more general regulation on this, giving the protection to all human remains located in maritime waters, irrespective of if they were underwater because maritime battle or elsewhere. And it was added at Rule 5 of the Annex that you must remind that has the same level of compulsory that the rest of the articles of the Convention, that the activities directed at underwater cultural heritage shall avoid the unnecessary disturbance of human remains or venerated sites. And this is important. I should have liked to see the words venerated sites not only in the annex, but in Article 2, 9 as well. But as already said, the Article 2 or the Rule 5 have both the same legal level of obligation. But the question of venerated sites gives us the possibility to discuss something which is, thanks God, changing in current archaeology. In general terms, but particularly with regard underwater cultural heritage, archaeology has been signs made by white men explaining white men history. Now this has changed, and we are abandoning the idea that we must only protect objects and go beyond and protect, for example, these venerated sites, which do not need to be around a particular object in the sense of the classical Western approach to the protection of cultural heritage. With regard the projection of the in situ rule, you may remind that this is again included among the objectives and general principles of the convention. The preservation in situ of underwater cultural heritage shall be considered as the first option. There is in Rule 5 of the Annex a most developed definition or most general approach to the in situ preservation rule as first option, including also the exceptions to this first option with regard the in situ preservation rule, which is to authorize any activity directed at the underwater cultural heritage for the purpose of making a significant contribution to the protection or knowledge or enhancement of this heritage. In this rule lacks the third possible exception to the in situ rule, preservation rule, which is a situation of danger that also may help to decide to protect or preserve the underwater cultural heritage ex situ. So the main rationale behind this in situ rule, which came from the general principle in international law, and particularly on environmental international law, which is the precautionary principle, is that the preservation of the protection of the underwater cultural heritage must be in its original context. That's the main idea behind this rule, in order to maintain as much as possible all the sources of knowledge and information of the archaeological site if it remained in its original context. Well, let me make a stupid pun with these words, and if we add just simply this, we will say that this is important. This is the projection, or maybe the projection of this in situ rule, if we also have in context the Aboriginal communities and peoples, in the sense of, okay, the idea is not only its natural context, but also its social, cultural, general context, which are building blocks of the in situ rule. Third, the question of the jurisdictional neutrality. As you may know, underwater cultural heritage is becoming an argument of new maritime claims. Canada in the Arctic with regard to this Northwestern Passage, for example, or China in the South China Sea, or sadly during these days, Russia in Crimea, is advancing arguments, including as a diplomatic tool, the existence and the connection of some underwater cultural heritage to their respective national maritime claims. And this, I think, it is dangerous for science and dangerous under the an ethical vision of what archaeology must be. But it is also unmethodological because, to put it simply, people's underwater cultural heritage does not necessarily equate to current states underwater cultural heritage. Heritage from different local communities may be perfectly now be shared or split among different states. And if just one state try to adopt as the owner or the only owner of this heritage, could be really dangerous. And this is quite normal. If you, for example, apart from the cases you may see in the screen, a quite recent case of looting in the East Mediterranean on an alleged Ottoman vessel, as fast as possible, some Turkish authorities says that, okay, this is a Turkish heritage, and just forgetting that the Ottoman Empire was not only Turkish, but a Mediterranean empire as well, so linking another peoples. But the convention, that in this sense, first, again, among its general principles, says that the state parties shall preserve UCH for the benefit of humanity in general. And second, and I think it is important with regard to this question of jurisdictional neutrality, in paragraph 11 of Article 2, it is said that no act or activity undertaken on the basis of this convention, that is, it refers to the activities, not to the underwater cultural heritage, shall constitute grounds for claiming, contending, or disputing any claim to national sovereignty or jurisdiction. These are the three main points I would like to discuss with you, but let me finish addressing a final point, which is what I consider a caveat in the definition of underwater cultural heritage in the 2001 convention. If you go through Article 1.1, the definitions, you may see that underwater cultural heritage means, all these, the wording of the definition given by the convention. But it is an exception in subparagraph C, when it is said that installations and other than pipelines and cables placed on the seabed and still in use shall not be considered as underwater cultural heritage. Well, what to do with, for example, the fish traps that you have seen in the photos that you have had on the screen, which are most of them still in use. They do not deserve the protection of the convention. I think this was a mistake when drafting the convention, and they were more thinking about pipelines, cables, and more modern, so to say, heritage sites. The possible solution will be a further reading of the convention in a complementary way with another UNESCO conventions, and most particularly with the Intangible Heritage Convention, because its Article 2.1 in its definitions precisely links tangible and intangible heritage. When defining the latter, it is said that it means the practiced representation, expressions, knowledge, skills, as well as the instruments, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces associated therewith that communities, groups, and in some cases individuals recognize. So the elements, the tangible elements associated to the intangible heritage is therefore protected by the 2003 conventions. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Thank you very much for the presentation, Mariano. And now I'll hand it over to Daria Davitti for a presentation on marine cultural heritage and the continuing relevance of the right to culture in international law and practice. Daria is Associate Professor in Public International Law at the Law Faculty of Lund, University of Sweden. Her research focuses on the intersection and implementation of international law, international economic law, and international human rights law in complex contexts, such as situations of armed conflicts, climate breakdown, humanitarian and health emergency, forced migration, large development projects. Just quickly to say that we will have questions at the end of all three presentations so that we can discuss them all together. Thank you. Daria, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria, and thank you everyone for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor as always to be here. I'm particularly happy to come after Professor Aznar's presentation because I think our work fits together and overlaps really nicely. So I'm going to be a bit brief, perhaps, but because I wanted to take home hopefully two main points, which are the two main arguments of this presentation, which basically is going to focus on the theoretical framework of international law that was at the basis of the project PPP Future. And my colleagues, Joseph Amolo and Luciana Tuo, who are also here, will present later on the findings of the empirical part of the work, of the field work that they took the lead and carried out in Lamo. So our project looked at the protection of marine cultural heritage in Lamo, in Old Lamo, and so what I'm going to present now is the theoretical underpinning, the theoretical underpinning of our project. So the two main points that I want to make today is that to explain that we took actually what Mariano just presented to us. We took the conventions, the UNESCO convention, the various conventions on cultural heritage as a starting point. So for us, as international lawyer, I guess we took them as a starting point, but as a non-exhaustive starting point for what we wanted to trace and map as a broader definition of marine cultural heritage, and in particular one that was really reinforced and strengthened by economic, social, and cultural rights, in particular the right to culture. So I'm just going to try and explain this to you today. So our main argument would be then that marine cultural heritage, so the reason why for us the UNESCO conventions can only be a starting point is because of the anthropocentric nature of the conventions, and how the conventions really show a divide between the human beings and the sea, right? So this separation in the way the law has, and this convention have looked at it. And so because they suggest a separation between land and sea, but also this separation perhaps between human and the sea, because what we see as very anthropocentric is separating nature in a bigger form from the humans. So for us, the idea was to try and see how marine cultural heritage, rather than maritime cultural heritage, could be perhaps given a new meaning to the work that we're doing. So we see marine cultural heritage, as part of many of our colleagues here, as referring to entire heritage landscapes, and also as a mirror of the symbiotic relationship between the human and the sea. So between the human being as part of nature and the sea as part of nature. So more about this symbiotic relationship. And our argument, perhaps controversial, but we're here to defend it, is that this symbiotic relationship comes fully to life through international law, in particular through the right to culture, but also through free, prior, and informed consent, on which Joshua will present later. So I'm not going to talk about this in much more detail. But what I will talk more about is the right to culture, and how it includes a focus on marginalized societies. So in particular, marginalized group like it could be indigenous people and their rights, but also at the same time it allows us to have a focus on intergenerational rights, futurity, and sustainability. Why? Well, if we look at the right to culture, and first of all, Article 27 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we see that this protects the right to freely participate for everyone in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts and share in the scientific advancement and its benefits, which is still very anthropocentric. But then if we move to Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, it also provides that states should take steps to achieve the full realization of the right and shall include those necessary for the conservation, development, and diffusion of science and culture. And if we then look at the definition of culture and the positive and negative obligation of the states, in the positive obligation, we see putting in place conditions to facilitate participation in cultural life, promotion of access to cultural life, and importantly for us, preservation of cultural goods. And cultural goods are understood as pertaining the right to culture to include, in a very broad way, so to include also nature's gifts. And this is where we see this symbiotic relationship, at least in also the work that we have done. No? So by looking at nature gifts such as the sea, lakes, rivers, mountains, forests, and natural reserves, including flora and fauna found there. And of course, for us, the importance of the mangroves in Lamu, it's also for the biodiversity and the preservation of the area and the resilience and adaptation. It's really important, which give nations their character and biodiversity. And also, cultural goods have been understood as including intangible cultural goods. So language, custom, traditions, belief, knowledge, and history. So for us, this is so the fact that the right to culture protects and this idea of cultural goods protects both nature gifts and intangible cultural goods, of course, is what allows us to give a dimension perhaps that goes beyond just human rights understood as the rights of human beings, but understood as the preservation and respect of planetary boundaries in a broader way, which is not immediately, in international law, is not an immediate equation that we do very often. So, and with this, Article 15, of course, brings special protection and special focus and attention to Indigenous people and persons living in poverty, which, of course, for our project, as my colleagues will explain later, is of particular relevance because of local fishermen of Lamu Old Town, who many of whom belong to Indigenous community, but also to the most deprived community in the area. So I will leave it here with something that is perhaps a bit controversial, and I'm hoping that we will take it up in the question and answers. But for us, that was the entry point for sustainable development and the entry point for, let's say, a broader and alternative look at the right culture and also a marine cultural heritage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daria. Thank you, because this really helps us to set the scene quite nicely for the presentation that will come in the second part of our workshop. So thank you. And now over to Haley Roberts for her presentation on marine cultural heritage and climate adaptation. Haley as well has received one of our grants, and Dr. Haley Roberts is senior lecturer in public international law at Bangor University, specializing in the international law of the sea. Her main research interests are in the areas of the protection of underwater cultural heritage and issues relating to climate change and the oceans and cultural heritage. Oops. She is a PI for our Rising from the Depth project, examining marine cultural heritage on climate adaptation policy. Haley is Commissioner, Vice Chair to the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales, and sits on the UK National Decade Committee for the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. So I'll hand it over to you, Haley.
Thanks, Anna Maria. I'm just going to share my screen and hope that it works because it wasn't playing ball earlier. Hopefully you can all see that. Fantastic. Okay. Okay, so I do feel a little bit weird about this presentation because it's a law and policy workshop. I am an international lawyer specializing in underwater cultural heritage, but I'm not going to be talking really about that. And to be honest, it is probably a little bit law light, but then I saw Daria and Mariano's papers and I felt a little bit better that other people are bringing the law at least. So I am talking about international law and policy, but in a sort of general sense. So as Anna Maria mentioned, I'm a PI for Rising from the Depths project. with researchers from the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. So my co-Is are experts in archaeology, heritage, climate adaptation. So during this presentation, I'm going to try and fit in and maybe speak a little bit quickly, a little bit about the project itself, just what we looked at, and then what we're kind of taking away from that. So what are the impacts of climate change on marine cultural heritage? What are the benefits for climate adaptation? Effectively, what we think should go into the policy, what policymakers should be considering when they're making these decisions, some of the challenges in doing that, and then really broad recommendations at the end, since we're kind of still just finishing up our report. Okay, so the advising from the Depth project that we have been doing examines the inclusion of marine cultural heritage as a climate adaptation priority in Tanzania's National Adaptation Plan. A really broad interpretation of marine cultural heritage has been adopted. We just want to include everything we possibly could. So intangible and tangible issues in relation to that, which is a new one for me because I'm not used to working with intangible heritage, but it has been a really, really good experience. So just so I'm bamboozling any jargon, the National Adaptation Plan, the NAP, is a process and a document, and it's a means of identifying adaptation needs and developing and implementing strategies and programs that could address those needs. And we considered that including this as a priority in Tanzania's NAP could attract then further support from international funds like the UNFCCC's Global Environment Facility. So that could raise capacities and kind of go on to do better things. We wanted to look at this because we felt that there was a little bit of grey area between climate law and heritage law. There seemed to be a little bit of a gap in the middle. Climate law and policy does really tend to neglect cultural heritage. I would probably go as far as saying it tends to neglect ocean issues more generally. And international treaties don't really provide for it either. So the Underwater Heritage Convention tends to focus on human intervention, its activities directed at underwater heritage. And although treaty bodies are doing some work in this area, so I know that the guys at UNESCO are doing some work in this, there just aren't a lot of resources. And law in general, I think, has struggled with that white ribbon zone. So it doesn't tend to take a holistic approach to land and sea. It tends to look at them separately. So we wanted to look at how climate policy could be used differently. So as part of this project, we wanted to explore key questions. So what's the value of marine cultural heritage? How are those impacted by climate change? Does it offer any opportunities to combat the negative effects of climate change, especially for coastal communities? So those are kind of values or benefits-based questions. To what extent is it easy to find information about the progress of the NAP in Tanzania? Is it easy to engage with policymakers? We had found this very difficult beforehand, so we were interested in knowing the experiences of other people at the workshop, and what level is community engagement taken at. And then finally, what are the key issues for policymakers? So effectively, how can we sell this to policymakers? How can we communicate all the benefits and things that we have found, and do it in a way that couches those benefits in the best way for policymakers to take on board? So just in relation to some of the impacts, climate change, as we know, is a threat magnifier. So if something is decaying, it is going to speed up that decay in all likelihood. So things like the sea level rise, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has said that between 1901 and 2018, global mean sea level rose by 20 centimetres. Probably don't need to be telling you this, we all know it's an issue. Sea level rise significantly impacts marine cultural heritage. It leads to coastal erosion, intense wave action, coastal flooding. So for example, Research has shown that out of 49 cultural World Heritage sites in low-lying coastal areas in the Mediterranean, as many as 42 are at risk of coastal erosion and 37 from flooding. So that is just an insane number. The image is of a little site that is just a stone's throw away from me. It's Dinastinilla Hillfort in Gwynedd in Wales, and that's just one example that I know that a lot of you have been involved with the Cherish project. So that's one site that they are looking at, trying to map that because it is being lost to coastal erosion. Ocean warming is another, again, IPCC identified that the ocean has persistently warmed over the last 50 years. It's taken up more than 90% of excess heat in the climate system, as sea temperature has reached a record high just last year. So warmer waters means more active waters. This increases erosion activity. Additionally, and the archaeologists out there will know this much better than I do, that some species of shipworm thrive in warmer waters. So we could get invasive species moving in as waters warm up, basically eating our wooden shipwrecks. And for metal ships, the corrosion of metals can increase with elevated temperatures. There's some more research being done on that at the moment, as far as I can see. Extreme weather, again, IPCC identified that between 1983 to 2012, it's probably the warmest 30-year period of the last 1400 years in the Northern Hemisphere. And I can imagine that since 2012, that is just going to get warmer. But extreme weather does mean extreme heat, cold, intense storm surge, hurricanes, rain, wind, all of those can impact heritage. So going from temperature extremes can affect the integrity of built heritage, for example. There's a lot of examples of storm surges and hurricanes exposing previously uncovered underwater heritage in intertidal areas as well. Ocean acidification, I think international law and policy have been quite slow to respond to ocean acidification. We still don't have any pH goals or really ocean-related goals, for example, in the Paris Agreement. So since the beginning of the industrial era, ocean acidity has increased by about 26%, so by about a quarter. And this higher pH can impact the integrity of steel or iron shipwrecks again. And as a separate but related issue, as these vessels, their corrosion is speeding up, that is going to be really problematic with shipwrecks still containing bunker fuel. So there's some big environmental issues waiting to happen. And all of those can lead to displacement. So these rising sea levels force people away from the coast. Extreme weather events can destroy homes and crops. Warming seas and ocean acidification impact fish breeding, habitats, loss of fishing grounds, food security. There are corals dying in areas because of ocean acidification and sea warming. So where diving tourism is economically significant, those areas are going to see big issues. And all of that drives people away, just leading to the loss of intangible cultural heritage. So traditional skills and livelihoods of traditional settlements are going to be lost. And really the bigger challenge is that all of those are being discussed in isolation, but quantifying, addressing all those threats in combination is going to be a big issue. So what can marine cultural heritage do about it? I think those of us working or researching in the heritage sector really realise the massive benefits that marine cultural heritage can have in the context of climate change and adaptation. But archaeology and cultural heritage have really been largely under-considered in the global climate response or law and policy. Really overall, policymakers and other stakeholders have demonstrated a near total lack of awareness of the values and benefits it can provide. It's just seen as something that we need to protect. And if we're deciding to protect objects or or people or biodiversity. You know, the resources have to give somewhere. It's really part of climate law and policy, but we wanted to change that. And I think in order to do that, we have to make sure that policymakers know the kind of benefits that it can have. So in terms of historical and archaeological benefits, and archaeology of climate change helps provide a really good foundation for assessing the implications of climate change across cultures. It can help design sustainable development strategies. And I know that a lot of network projects are kind of really good examples of that. Sustainable tourism does offer some good opportunities for green growth. However, on the other hand, there's some really obvious challenges to this. Sustainable tourism can be really, really difficult to achieve in practice. As we can see with Venice here, increased footfall can damage heritage. It can result in conflict with locals, land degradation. It further impacts communities negatively and making them less resilient. So we really need to be achieving a balance. So it is important to recognise that there are benefits in tourism, but other economic and environmental benefits should also be explored, like retrofitting or repurposing built heritage. Social and cultural, it can provide preserve tangible and intangible cultural heritage, can increase community resilience by empowering communities. And damage to cultural heritage can actually do the opposite. It can sever a community's attachment to a place. So heritage really is that stimulus of social cohesion and giving people a sense of place. So promoting and preserving traditional fishing practices, for example, can foster cultural identity, a sense of place, and bring people together. And scientific and environmental benefits are massive. It really is in a unique position to provide insights as to how past civilizations respond to changes in climate and extreme weather, geological events. So it can provide key data how communities might adapt to future challenges. So there's been one archaeology project in Tanzania that discovered evidence of past tsunami activity in Pangani Bay, an area which was previously considered to be low risk. So that data is going to be really valuable because climate-linked geological changes can increase tsunami threats. And similarly, during the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, a tribe on the Andaman Islands were able to escape to higher ground, saving everybody in that tribe because of folklore and oral traditions that they had of early warning signs of tsunamis. So it is a really, really valuable tool in that respect. I'll speed through these quickly, so I only have 2 slides left. Some of the challenges, as I've already mentioned, stakeholder awareness. In terms of our project in Tanzania, we found it really, really difficult to get in touch with people. The website was out of date. It shows heads of department from years ago. There was no contact addresses, no updates on the NAP process. And even people that worked in other government departments, like the Antiquities departments, for example, that came to our workshop, they were asking other people in the workshop what was going on with the NAP. So they'd obviously not been consulted. But I think that is quite true of most countries, or maybe for the UK in any case. So in the UK, it's difficult to contact civil servants. They're always moving, that there's no contact emails for them. So it is really hard to get that connection. Community awareness of heritage benefits could also be a challenge. Some participants in our workshop reported that some heritage had been damaged within communities for various reasons. So removing it to build new houses, for example, because of a lack of awareness of the benefits that it could bring. And it was really difficult to know how much the government had engaged with communities in the NAP process, even though that is clearly a really crucial aspect, because most of the knowledge of marine cultural heritage is localized. So those working at a national level will simply not be able to kind of grasp everything. They won't be able to have enough oversight over everything. So they can absolutely use those communities as people on the ground. So to realise those benefits, engaging with traditional and local ecological knowledge is really key. A lack of capacity, lack of skills, resources, that could be a challenge. If there's little capacity to work together at international and national levels, that's going to remain problematic. And as I said, approaches are quite siloed. And again, as this intensifies, if it's going to intensify quicker than we can adapt, so sea level rise is happening at an alarming rate, then the likelihood of realising these benefits decreases. Resources will need to be directed elsewhere. So these are overlapping challenges. And this is my last slide. Recommendations probably is not an accurate term. There probably some of that are recommendations, some are much broader. So maybe just observations. But including marine cultural heritage as a priority on a NAP document should happen, I think, in every NAP, not just in Tanzania. So this is on a kind of more global scale. I guess ensuring a cultural heritage expert sits on the NAP drafting team, so they actually know what they're doing, they're able to feed in those values. Promoting the benefits of marine cultural heritage to stakeholders, needing engagement with community and local groups for a bottom-up approach to adaptation planning, identifying opportunities for green growth in sustainable heritage tourism, but not just that. And then I suppose some, I don't know, wish list items. So greater synergy between international treaty regimes that deal with cultural heritage, marine cultural heritage and climate change, trying to get a greater understanding and appreciation of cultural heritage in climate policy making in general. And this came up quite a bit in our workshop, but the need for further research and collaboration between marine cultural heritage, ocean science and law and policy to kind of help plug gaps and bridge those areas as well. I had to give some image credits at the end. Apologies, I think I went over by a couple of minutes.
Please don't apologize. Don't apologize, Hayley, because it was a great presentation, and even a few minutes past your time, it's absolutely fine. And thank you very much to all three speakers for their presentation today. I think they very clearly set the scene of our discussion and what are the interactions in more specific terms by looking at the UN conventions, and more general terms by looking at the right to culture within the international law framework. And then, Hayley, I think you complemented that really well by looking at the policy issues and how to make marine cultural heritage relevant from a policy perspective, which is at the end is what we need to try to achieve, especially since the NAPs seem to be so important in a development context, and often donors try to align their projects to the NAPs and to the other development programs, policy documents that developing countries have. So it's important to question, where is marine cultural heritage in that panorama? Because if it doesn't appear there, then definitely it won't appear on the ground when it comes to the implementation of the projects. Now, I just would like to know if anyone has any question from the forum. Please do feel free to raise your hand or just turn your camera on so that we can have a question and we can have participations from the floor as well. I'm trying to check the chat and there is no specific question in the chat yet. One thing that I need to ask you that is not related to specific questions is I would like to ask everybody to turn their camera on, because we need to have a picture. So it's a bit of a more technical issue, but I was reminded to do. So in the meantime, I see that Arturo has his hand raised, but before we go to the question, if we can just turn the camera on, make yourself beautiful, and we can take a picture. And I hope that the person who asked me to do that is happy. Oh, very good. It's actually very lovely to see everyone, and it's something we should do more often to keep our camera on, because it's so nice to see everyone and see so many people participating to the workshop. So please don't be shy, turn the camera on, and also feel free to ask questions. Here it is, we have another question as well. So it's great to see that hand starts coming up. So Arturo, I hand it over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Now I want to thank you, the three speakers, for the wonderful presentations and all the different items and recommendations that they have put forward. My question goes more to Professor Adnar, and then all the others can maybe have also some idea on this. I mean, as you know, I mean, with these international conventions are mainly state conventions. It's very difficult to have the representation of local communities and indigenous communities to have a voice in the governing bodies, no, and in the decision making and in the monitoring processes when they exist. I remember in the World Heritage Convention, there was an issue, and there was the intention in 1995 to create an advisory body for the convention formed by indigenous communities, and told the different state delegates, I mean, that they stopped that petition eventually because there was a problem of jurisdiction and decision making. No? Eventually that came up again, and there was the creation of a policy forum for indigenous communities recently, I mean, in the last 15 years, without decision power. So my question is mainly, one of the issues that was raised, especially in the evaluation done, the audit done to the 2001 convention in 2019, was that idea of lack of voices and representativeness of indigenous and local communities in the decision process of the convention. And it's been one of the recommendations. How would be possible to create this in the current governance of the 2001 convention at international level, or how can this be implemented at the national level? I mean, if you have some thoughts about that, Mariano, thank you.
Thank you, Arturo, for your question. It is really complex, and the evaluation process of the convention has disclosed a lot of gaps still existing with regard how to better implement the convention. For example, the lack of a monitoring system is one of these, and with regard these questions of implementation, states are really very jealous of their position in the international decision-making process, in the sense that in a sensitive, in questions so sensitive as underwater cultural heritage from political terms, states are really reluctant to give more room to non-state entities on the decision making. And why I say this? Because if you know or you remember the making of the convention, one of the main points was the discussion between what a French author a long time ago discussed as la dialectique de l'objet, la dialectique du lieu. That is, that the convention was drafting to protect cultural heritage, but the problem was that this heritage was located on maritime zones. And the questions of how to govern, how to give voice, how to regulate any single point regarding the law of the sea question, states don't want to touch the delicate equilibrium drafted in UNCLOS, in the law of the sea. So, for example, if you see the jurisprudence of the Inter-American Code of Human Rights, and I link this with human rights and the presentations by Daria, it has been clearly said that indigenous people, because of their rights to their ancestral lands, must have a voice when states, at least in America, in the Western Hemisphere, must have a voice on how to draft new boundaries. Not only land boundaries, but the projection at sea of these land boundaries, and then affecting directly to coastal management and underwater cultural heritage. Well, this has been neglected generally by states, by sovereign states, because this jealousy about all these jurisdictional questions. In any case, and you are well aware of this, in a couple of UNESCO missions sent by the staff, particularly to two Latin American countries, in Bolivia and in Guatemala, the voice of the local communities was taken in account on how to better protect the underwater cultural heritage close to these communities.
Thank you very much. And now there is another hands raised, and is Tembe, please.
Hi there, it's lovely to see everybody. So I caught the end, the second and the third presentation, and really impressed, incredibly impressed, and really interesting to hear other colleagues' experiences, and very validating actually, especially the bit, Hayley, about having resistance from the authorities and state and governments, because that's also been our experience. I just wondered, are any of your Tanzanian colleagues online, Hayley, with who participated in this project? Because I think it would be really interesting to hear from them about how the Tanzanians approach, if anyone had any insight on how their governments approach it.
I've had a quick look and I can't see either of them. They're both in Dar es Salaam, but I can't see them on this workshop. Yeah. So I don't know if they registered for it.
So, I mean, I think I was in a very privileged position because I've been working in Tanzania on and off since '91, and previously had a job as a journalist, so had a lot of contacts in government, and also very good people on our advisory board. But like you, hit lots of hurdles, and would really value talking to you in private or after this at some point. But my question is about sort of what international bodies might be responsible for both giving funds and also ensuring and enforcing existing laws regarding protection of maritime environments. Our research showed that local fishermen and farmers had an extraordinarily high knowledge of their intangible cultural heritage. I mean, really surprisingly so. And well, I suppose only surprising because I hadn't assumed it would be so high. And so it seemed to me to be imperative to get funding, because there's certainly no shortage of people who can do it, but funding to push forward local initiatives in country, in Tanzania, in my case, because that's where we worked. But might there be, this issue around the sort of protection of indigenous people's access to their livelihoods and their burial sites. I know that the World Bank is doing a lot of work on this at the moment. Is it possible to almost leverage governments into a position of having to do things? Because what our research showed is that laws may exist, but they definitely aren't being implemented, and the no fish zones were not being respected, and fishermen's knowledge was not being respected. They were not being consulted at all. And one of the things that came out of our research, a strong recommendation, is that in dog years, development has to take into account in-depth consultation with the communities affected, because they are the people who know and understand it. I think around the issue of indigenous, it's really problematic, because in Tanzania there are 122 tribes, of which I think the Maasai have finally been valued as been talked about as indigenous, but you know, who's indigenous in that context, and what happens when people are squatters? That's a really big problem, or people are intermarrying, which they do a lot in the areas we're working. So yeah, does anyone in the panel, anyone on this meeting, have any thoughts about what kind of international bodies might be able to leverage, pressure, offer advice, facilitate, however, to push reluctant state governments, or even indeed corporate. One of the things I did was get in touch with the people who are responsible for dredging the port in Tanga and say, here we are, we can give you loads of information about the community you're about to, didn't use the word destroy, but that is what they were going to do. And they didn't take us up on it. So yeah, I mean, any thoughts, anybody?
I mean, I guess that is the $1,000,000 question, isn't it? How do you get policymakers to do what they want and what you want and what they should be doing? I think you'll find that is an issue everywhere, I'd imagine. I suppose implementation and enforcement of those things varies from country to country, and same at an international level when you're talking about enforcing international law. Yeah, well, I guess the events of the past couple of weeks have shown how well that can go down. But I suppose that is one thing we were really trying to do with our project, was to see, okay, how can we, like I said earlier, sell this to policymakers? How can we communicate what we know to them? And I guess if you have a combination of this, well, I don't know, this probably won't work either, but this is what you should be doing, this is what the law says, but also this is what you get out of it effectively, and sell those benefits in a way that they want. So what matters to them and what we have, and try to meet those both in the middle. And then once that gets on the national adaptation plan, and I know that you're not just talking about in a climate change context here, but once that gets on the NAP as a priority, then the state can try to get funding from other international funds, like there's an UNFCCC mechanism that they can apply to. There's a least developed countries fund, and I know that the people working in that area will know more than me about them. So kind of selling it in a sense that, you know, this is important, but this is going to make you some money, so please can you put it in your plan? So yeah, I guess that is a little bit of a jaded way of looking at it, but yeah, I think it's a problem everywhere, and I can see that Anna Maria's got her hand up as well, so she might be able to offer better insights than me.
No, I just raised my hand to show you that, you know, I was happy to chip in if you wanted to. And I guess for us lawyers, asking about enforcement of international law is just not a question. You know, we don't deal with it because we know how it ends, especially, you know, nowadays, as you said. No, but I think, Tembe, that one of the major point is, regardless of what are the bodies that specifically would be able to enforce such legislation, of course, at national level, it all is different from country to country. But I just wanted to say that brings erase the importance of the work that we're doing in terms of raising awareness and providing evidence. So I truly look forward to reading your report about your project, Tembe, because this is where we will see, and we will have concrete elements to start a proper lobbying activity based on specific evidence that you have collected. And this is why I think we need to continue emphasizing the importance of the work that we've been doing. And then, of course, there are lots of various ways in which the law can be enforced. Even strategic litigations nowadays has proved to be incredibly important for bringing certain issues to the fore and to the attention of policymakers and legislation. But I see that Mariano has got his hands up, so I want him to have a chance to intervene. Please, Mariano.
No, just very briefly, because sometimes this is a typical thing that happens to internationalists, that is to feel ourselves so important that we are the only responsible to implement international law. And we must remind that the main actors implementing international law are states. And we must not forget that this is the first duty that any state has when, for example, ratifying a convention. And I will be politically incorrect, since I am here just speaking as an individual, saying that I've seen that during the meeting of state parties, for example, in the 2001 UNESCO Convention. We already have 71 state parties, and just some of them have seriously facing how to correctly implement the convention into their respective domestic legislation. I am perfectly aware that there is a lot of countries that cannot or don't know or need assistance from the international level to implement some parts of the convention. But sometimes, you know, the strange sensation that one have if you go up to the international level decision-making process is that, okay, let's ratify treaties, because if they lack of a monitoring system like the 2001 convention, nobody will monitor us and how we are implementing this particular convention. So to sum up, I think that the international community must be backing all these countries that cannot, because they lack of resources, financial, personal, of any kind. We must back these countries, but at the same time, we must be seriously, and when I say we, I say the state parties or the international community in general, to remind every single day to states that international obligations are there to be fulfilled and to be implemented, particularly by the states.
Thank you very much, Mariano. I see John has got his hands up, so John, please.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the idea of states. I mean, the problem with the 2001 convention for me, we were talking about communities, and we talk a lot about communities in the Rising from the Depths project, and we all, I think, agree that community consultation and community involvement is important in terms of the work that we're doing and trying to reach policies and try to reach governments, even though in some cases that might scare governments. But the 2001 convention is particular in that, yeah, it seems to be very state focused, and the idea of actually having communities involved in it seems to be different. And I know it's at the center of some of the other conventions that are perhaps more widely adopted. Something like the World Heritage Convention calls upon state parties to adopt a policy which allows the community to be involved in the implementation of the convention. And I wonder, is the 2001 convention just not there yet? And if why that's the case, and how can we actually involve communities as opposed to states in something like the convention? And is that to do with the fact that the way that it operates? I don't know. I was just going to ask that question. To Mariano, sorry.
Please, will you speak up a bit, Mariano? It's quite difficult for me to hear you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. This is really important what you're asking. And any convention is a bargaining play, in the sense that you can agree when you arrive to some kind of consensus, and you have that. I don't want to be seen as the champion of the UNESCO Convention, this for sure. But in the case of this convention in particular, which I think it is a really important scientific effort, because the convention, as it has been said, it is important, particularly, for example, for the annex and all the questions implied on this scientific endeavor that the convention is. But it is absolutely true that communities or indigenous people have no room on this kind of text like the UNESCO Convention. But Daria, I think, gave us a quite important point, reminding that the convention is a starting point. It is not the end of the route. And Article 6 of the convention particularly deals with this, in the sense that now we have already arrived to this first step, this first point. Let's go beyond. not necessarily concluding new hard law agreements, new treaties, which are really complex to agree, but try to imagine how to work with soft law instruments like memorandum of understandings and so on among states particularly concerned on this. And if these developing agreements, so to say, going beyond the convention, respect the main principles of the convention, let's go ahead. And one of the issues could be how to better implement the convention with the participation, with effective participation of the local communities. But it is really complex, depending on the level of the negotiation making process. Then the voice of the indigenous people and so on could be heard better or not. Imagine.
I think that's, sorry.
No, go.
No, I just think it's interesting because one of the things that we're trying to do in our project is the idea of opening up the idea of cultural heritage being marine, linking coast and sea together. So we're almost sort of linking the terrestrial and the maritime approaches in a legal sense and in a protection sense. And I always thought we'd get much more leeway, we'd gain more ground on the terrestrial front and the involvement of communities than trying to work within the underwater convention, even though that would have to happen at a different level. And part of the reason is that state involvement, and also the idea of coastal jurisdiction is a particular sticking point. So when we're talking about local communities being involved in the process, it becomes more difficult.
Yeah, but it depends also on the so to see spatial application approach of a convention. Because if you, for example, see in the Mediterranean, within the general framework of the Barcelona Convention for the Mediterranean, within the UNEP program, and you see, you go across the, for example, the 2001 Madrid Protocol on integrated coastal zone management, the question of the underwater cultural heritage, it is foreseen. And in Article 14, which is really interesting, the questions of participation of local communities is expressly included in this protocol. It is true that this protocol has received not too many ratifications so far, but for example, the European Union is included in that. That could be a model to be exported to other maritime zones. Could be in the Caribbean. There is a so to say, it has been echoed, this system of the Barcelona Convention General, not the coastal management zones in the Caribbean, but perhaps in other places, this model could be echoed.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm a little bit conscious of time because it's 3:30, and I'm a bit conscious that if we want to have a quick break, we need to do it now to give enough time to the speakers in the second part of the workshop. But thank you very much, everyone, for the comments that you made. I see that there are some comments in the chat as well. So you can, and some links that have been posted. I don't know, Arturo, was it you to post the link on the chat? No, Lea has been putting the links to the chat. Okay, perfect. So if you want to have a look at the chat as well, I suggest that we have a 5 minutes break now and we reconvene at 3:35. Oh, Daria, you had your hands up. I'm so sorry. No, sorry, Daria, because it's you have a white background, so I couldn't see it. I don't know what else.
No, it was only really maybe to conclude briefly. I think that's because I think this brings us very nicely to the next panels. It's so where we stopped here when we talked about the difficulty of implementation, but I think that's also where, and you mentioned it yourself, no? This is, I think, where human rights law and this is why the right to culture and free, prior and informed consent are becoming more and more important. And in strategic litigation, especially recent cases in which is also in the national constitution of many South American countries. So I think it's important because it's becoming increasingly a point linked to you know, I know Lea will talk about the right to healthy environment, but also not only against states, because John mentioned state, but also against for instance, a recent case against the European Investment Bank, no, that went to the Court of Justice of the European Union. So I think the net is becoming wider. Of course, the challenges before us when it comes to the implementation of international law and protection are huge, but I think there are strategic ways that are kind of closing some of the gaps, although of course, it's only a step in the right direction. So I just wanted to link this because it's probably quite good with what we're going to discuss later.
Yes, thank you very much. Absolutely, Daria. And I saw that Cesar had his hands raised as well. So Cesar, if you want to intervene, please, by all means. I was clearly calling for the break too soon. Cesar, no?
Only he had some connection problems, so he's on and off, so probably he can do it. Ah, he's there.
Oh, here it is, Cesar.
Oh, thank you very much. How are you?
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, I have a problem with my internet and I think I raised my hand by mistake.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay, no worries at all. No worries at all. Okay, then thank you very much, everyone. I'll see you again in 5 minutes at 3:35. Let's have a very quick comfort break. Hello, everyone. So I think we can resume as 3:30. So now, thank you very much, really, for all the discussions we had in the first part and for the lovely presentations. Now, I'm a bit concerned about time because I want everyone to have time to show the research and participate. So our next presentations is by Joshua Ngulu. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Nottingham. So Joshua is one of my very dear students. And Joshua has a PhD scholarship from the Rising from the Dead. I mean, very much linked to it because it's given by the University of Nottingham, really linked to the project. And his presentation today is on free, prior, and informed consent, cultural heritage in Kenya. Josh, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Anne. Can you see my slides? Right, thank you for the introduction. I'll go straight to my presentation. I'll start by giving the outline of my presentation. I look at the background of my research, my PhD study, and then I look at the definition on the context I am carrying out my research on blue economy. I look at the aspects of or components of blue economy and narrow down to the LabSet project in Lamu. And then I'll problematize the key issues informing my thesis. And then I come back to the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, looking at the legal framework, and also look at the current jurisprudence on this principle, and look at the state obligation to observing cultural heritage, and then I conclude. So I'll start by saying that oceans provide us with the food and is key to our livelihoods. And the ocean economy contributes approximately 3% of global value of our global value, and it's been projected that the ocean would have the potential to have the output, the growth of the global economy. And it's good to note that the blue world is made up of very large, vast lakes and oceans, and is an extensive ocean resource base. And Africa is one of the bluish continent because 38 of the African states are coastal states. So in Africa, most of the imports are carried out through the sea. 90% of the exports are conducted by the sea, and is one of the strategic gateway to international trade in the region. And looking at Kenya, it is of strategic location. It is strategically located in the East African coast along the Indian Ocean. And this location has endeared the Kenyan government look at one of the blue economy, to look at blue economy as one of the catalysts to achieving our 2030 agenda. So how do you define blue economy? I say that there is no universally accepted definition of the term blue economy, and it has been interpreted by different organizations to mean different things. But generally, blue economy is a term in economics relating to the exploitation and preservation of the environment. And in international development, blue economy is used when describing the sustainable approach to coastal resources. It has several components. We have components like fisheries, We have renewable energy, we have tourism, climate change, waste management, and we also have infrastructure development, where I'm looking at or pitching my research in relationship to the LAPSET project. So, sorry. So look at the SDGs, particularly SDG 14, looks at the sustainable use of the ocean seas to attain sustainable development. And looking at this issue of SDG 14, there should be encouragement to better stewardship in the use of ocean blue resources for the sake of the present generation and the next generation. So how has Kenya invested in the blue economy? So I'll say that Kenya has prioritized the sustainable utilization of ocean resources and the blue economy agenda to enable it achieve the 2030 agenda. So it is looking at the ocean as a smart investment that can deliver socio-economic and environmental benefits. So in line with achieving this agenda, it has invested in 25 billion US dollars LAPSET project. And these are very huge project because it is a half of the Kenyan's GDP. So look at the map there. So look at down there at the ocean, you see Lamu. So that's where it is being, the development is taking place. And I asked myself, so why is Lamu important? Why the interest in Lamu? And three issues. Number one is that Lamu and its environs is the one of the oldest and best preserved Swahili settlers in East Africa, and it has retained its traditional functions, and is a UNESCO gazetted World Heritage Site, cultural because of the rich cultural heritage. And the other thing is that this place is inhabited by indigenous vulnerable peoples who are marginalized, who are very poor, and rely on the traditional way of living, like traditional fishing and traditional way of livelihood. And there's a lot of violations of human rights, and especially cultural heritage and the marine cultural heritage against the local communities living in this around Lamu. And this has been informed by the complaints which have been raised by the people, the civil society organizations, and also the litigation which is taking place around the issues to do with the cultural heritage in Lamu. So I'd like to problematize the key issues which are informing my thesis. And number one is that the state did not consult or seek consent. I'll be coming back to these issues later. The local community on the cultural, how this project affects the cultural heritage, their cultural heritage. And this project was designed or implemented without proper public participation. And number three is that there was no proper environmental and social impact assessment carried out before the implementation of the project. And then mitigation measures were not put into consideration, which are consistent with the principles of sustainable development. So now I want to come to the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. And what does it mean? Again, I'll say that there is no universal definition of this principle, but it has four concepts. Number one is free, number two is prior, number three is informed, and number three is consent. So what does free mean? Free means that this consent should be given free of charge, and the community is not to be subjected to coercion, intimidation, or manipulation. Prior means that the concept is sought sufficiently in advance of any authorization or commencement of the activities or of the project. And then the consent or the information should be informed in a way that the community should be engaged prior and given proper information which is articulate and which is objective. And then consent is that the communities should be given the opportunity to give consent within the context of their customary settings. So now, so what is a legal framework? Unpacking, I mean the legal framework informing the concept of free, prior and informed consent. We have environmental law instruments which inform this concept. Although it's one to check that these environmental law instruments do not specifically refer directly to the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, but there is a big relationship between the indigenous peoples and the environmental law instruments, and one of which is sustainable development and the linking of the respect of their land, of their ancestral and traditional land. So one of the declarations in environmental law is principle number 22 of the Rio Declaration, and which demands and recognizes the support of indigenous peoples in culture and interest and enable their participation in the achievement of sustainable development. We also have Agenda 21, which protects, and specifically chapter 26, protects indigenous peoples from activities that environmentally unsound or that are concerned or considered to be socially, culturally inappropriate. We also have the Cartagena Protocol on biodiversity, which provides for consultation and participation in matters which directly affect indigenous peoples, especially on transborder movement, transit, and using of living organisms, and blocking of potential effects of harmful activities against indigenous peoples. When you come to Kenya, we have the Constitution of Kenya, because it has several articles. I'm not going to look at them, but one of the articles is Article 10, which talks about principles of public participation. But we also have another provision which is against deprivation of persons' property. We also have the Mining Act, we have Land Act, we have Community Land Act, and all these acts, because of time, I'm not looking at all the provisions, but there are express provisions talking about respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and protecting them against abuse of their rights in terms of their land, I mean ancestral land, and also when it comes to investment on their lands, they're supposed to be given the opportunity to participate and give consent before implementation of the projects affecting them. I'll move ahead and look at another instrument, of course not environmental, but an independent one, which is called the Indigenous and Tribal Peoples ILO, International Labour Organization 169 Convention. And these are very important convention for the fact that it is the only legally binding legal instrument which is still open for ratification. Kenya has not ratified this convention, though it is not, therefore it is not bound by it. But it's a very important convention because it manifests several concepts on land, consultation, and participation. They form the key issues in the convention. There's Article 7, Article 15, and Article 15. Article 7 looks at the right to decide priorities for the process of development, which affects the lives, beliefs, ritual, and the lands occupied by indigenous peoples. And Article 15 talks about the right to participate by indigenous persons on management and conserving their resources. The other convention I look at is the Biodiversity Convention, 1992 Convention, which is also a very important convention, and talks about the respect, preserving and maintaining indigenous peoples, and their promotes their practices with the, I mean, whatever should happen is that the rights should be promoted, and consent should be sought. They should provide consent before implementation of any activity in their ancestral land. Okay, the other convention is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This convention is not legally binding, so it's a soft law, and so not having a binding obligation among states. But it's important to note that this convention has attained, or declaration has attained, authoritativeness and legal consensus concerning indigenous peoples. There are several articles in this convention which are very key, and I looked at Article 18, Article 26, Article 3, and all of them are talking about participation of indigenous peoples in matters that would affect them. And Article 3 talked about the right to self-determination, and for the indigenous peoples to freely determine their economic, social, and cultural development. So one of the important things to note about this declaration is that states are supposed to consult and cooperate with indigenous peoples, either as a whole or with their representative institutions, in order to obtain free and informed consent prior to the application of any project affecting their lands and resources. One of the controversies about this declaration is that the question is whether indigenous peoples enjoy an unqualified veto. The question is, can they curtail the state if they do not give the consent when the state wants to carry out a project? Or should the truth provision be approached with a certain degree of flexibility, in other words, to give the state and indigenous peoples the opportunity to have a consultative process? The other thing which I want to look at is the United Nations human rights treaty bodies, and look
Joshua.
at, yes.
Joshua, I hate to interrupt you, but you're already 10 minutes over your allocated time.
Yes.
So if you can maybe wrap up as soon as you can.
Yes, Anna, yeah.
Thank you, sorry.
Yes. So one of the human rights treaties is the Committee on the Elimination of Against Discrimination, and it stresses that the state should seek consent of indigenous peoples before a project can take place. And we also have the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is anchored under Article 15A of the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, whereby states parties should obtain free, prior, and informed consent for indigenous peoples in matters concerning their cultural resources. And the other one is the Human Rights Committee. Of course, this one looks at the compliance of the ICCPR, and it's anchored on Article 27, which promotes progressive interpretation of the right to culture. Now, because of time, I look at jurisprudence, which is coming out under free, prior, and informed consent. And one of the regional courts is the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And one of the main cases is Saramaka People vs. Suriname. And the question which was before the court was to determine, among other things, whether the logging and concessions awarded by Suriname to third parties on Saramaka's ancestral lands amounted to violations of their property rights under Inter-American Convention, Article 27. And the court ordered the state, which intends to launch, authorize a project affecting resources found within indigenous people lands, should ensure the effective participation of the members of the community development or investment or plan. The other case, which is very important, is was before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the Center of Minority Rights Development versus Kenya. Human rights lawyers call it the Endoris case, and where Endoris were relocated from their ancestral land. And the question which was before the court was the violation of the right to property, resources, and development. And the court held that the state, as a duty, or rather the commission, the state has a duty not only to with the community, but also to obtain free, prior and informed consent according to their customs, tradition relating to development or investment projects having a major impact within their territory. We have other cases before the High Court. We have Moi Col Basin Col local community versus the Minister for Energy. And you also have Mohammed Ali Badi case versus the AG and 11 others. The Moi Basin case was about mining of coal in a community whereby they were not, a consent was not obtained from them. And the court said that the government has a duty to seek views from the community and act in good faith when they are seeking consent from the community. The Mohammed Ali Badi case is about the LAPSET project. Again, the issues to do with public participation are coming out in this case, and the court was very specific that the government ought to carry out public participation, proper public participation before and in the process of carrying out the project in Lamu. So in winding up, I'll say that the state has 3 obligations. Number 1 is obligation to respect. Number 2 is obligation to protect. And number 3 is obligation to fulfill in terms of fulfilling the rights to do with cultural heritage. And my last thing is that to say is that my thesis is of the view that Kenya has conceptualized the blue economy as an economic model, and there is a need to integrate issues to do with the cultural development. And one of the things the state should do is to revisit is a weak rule of law and enhance implementation of the law to ensure that integration of cultural heritage takes place in the development, in development, and also adhere to the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Joshua. And now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Leah. Leah is a PhD student at the University of Nottingham as well. She's my student, and her presentation will be Is Illegal Financing Fossil Fuel Mega Project in Mozambique in the Era of Climate Change.
Okay, can you see my screen? Yes, I would think so.
Yes.
Okay,
Joshua,
perfect.
can you please mute yourself?
Okay, so I will start. So good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today. So yes, I'm a third-year PhD student at the University of Nottingham. And today I'm going to present my research that focuses on the legal barriers to phasing out fossil fuels in Mozambique and how these might affect marine cultural heritage. So I will first talk about the interaction between climate change and cultural heritage, specifically Mozambique, because thanks to the great presentation from Halle, we already have a great idea of how climate change and marine cultural heritage intertwined. And I will then give an overview of the mega projects in the country and how they impact the territory. Finally, then I will present my research and the preliminary results of my research. So first, Mozambique is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change. It's ranked 154 out of 182 countries in the Indigen Country Index, which is for vulnerability. And according to the research of our colleagues, Caridad Ballestero and Luciana Esteves, it is the African coastline that shows high or very high exposure to coastal hazard. So it means, in sum, it means that Mozambique, albeit being one of the countries that contributed the least to climate change, it's facing its harshest consequences. And also on top of that, being one of the least developed countries in the world, it also has the least means in terms of skills and monetary to cope with the harshest effects of climate change. So what does it mean in reality, concretely? So we have seen an increase in temperature, change in rainfall and sea level rising, as also was pointed out by highly in the very specific context of climate change. It means intensified droughts, stronger cyclones, heavier storms, and floods. And we have some very important example of the effect of climate change in 2019, where cyclone Idai and Kenneth have ravaged the coast. This is the first time ever recorded in history that two strong tropical cyclones hit the country within the same season. More recently, and on top of that, the cyclone Idai was one of the strongest that ever hit the coast of Mozambique. On top of that, not long ago in January 2022, we had the tropical storm Anna that ravaged the coast of Madagascar and Mozambique. So how does this affect climate and how does this affect marine cultural heritage? Well, on this, Haley has explained it very, very greatly, so I won't dwell on that. And in the context of Mozambique, we've got two aspects that are particularly important, that are natural barriers and how this marine cultural heritage can respond to climate change. And in this case, we have mainly the importance of mangrove forests and coral reefs that are important for climate to protect the countries against the harshest effect of climate change, are protective barriers. In the case of mangrove forests, it's very important. Those are very important assets because they are nature-based solutions for adaptations, what we call nature-based solutions. So in fact, they act as not only a natural barrier against climate change, but they also work as carbon sinks. And on this, also our colleague Amina Juma has conducted extensive research on the deforestation of the mangrove forests in East Africa. So although any coastal development would increase the number of people in investment at higher levels of exposure to climate change, and this is one of the results from Ballesteros and Esteves. Nonetheless, in Mozambique, we have had a development of a series of mega projects in the fossil fuel industry. Some of them are very recent, and they are mainly, as you can see in the map, those are all the mega projects that I've identified. They're mainly developed on the coast of Mozambique. And these projects would have the double effects, not only to contribute to climate change intensively, but it will also impact the local environment and the local communities. So as you can see from the map, we have, except for the coal mining projects in the Tete region, we have all sorts of projects on the coast. So we've got hydrocarbon exploration in Angoche, Zambezi, and Sofala, which are still in the exploration phase. Then we have the more the older Panda and Temane gas fields that are like the pioneers from Sasol, from South Africa, that have been implemented. It's the orange one. And on top, and most importantly, we've got the offshore extraction and onshore production of gas in the Rovuma Basin. So I'm going to just give you a little bit more details about this project to give you an idea of what we're dealing with. So this mega project in Cabo Delgado is one of the biggest mega projects ever developed in Africa, not only for the amount of money that is being poured into this project, that is almost twice the annual GDP of Mozambique, but also because of the massive reserves of gas that are present in the area. It's more than 180 trillion cubic feet of gas deposits. So the presence of this mega project in the north of the country threatens, of course, tangible marine cultural heritage assets. So not only, as I say, it directly contributes to climate change, the construction per se, only the construction alone, is anticipated to increase Mozambique's greenhouse gas emissions by 10% by 2022. On top of that, it threatens the neighboring UNESCO biosphere of the Caribbean archipelago. And also it has a devastating effect on the environment and the local population. And in this sense, there are several reports that have reported on the infringement of rights to a healthy environment and on human rights more generally. Human Rights Watch has been reporting widely on the area. In this, it is important to note that in 2021, in October, the United Nations Rights Council adopted a resolution recognizing the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as an important human right. And this is important in this context because before we were talking about the implementation, and in this it can be it's important to note also that the right to a general satisfactory environment is also guaranteed in the Article 24 of the African Charter. That also has a commission for its implementation and a court. And this right requires states to take reasonable and other measures to prevent pollution and ecological degradation, which in this case, it is not the case, of course, of the CAS mega project. And it also has it's a composite right. It's not only about the protection of the environment, but also as promotion of development in Africa. So development that protects the environment, which would not be the case either in this case. And lastly, it also threatens intangible assets because there is an ongoing civil war linked to the mega projects. We've got massive rights abuse everywhere and also problems in the resettlement schemes, which in other terms mean that, for example, fishermen that carry out their skills and knowledge as fishermen have been resettled inland, so they do not only they do not have a livelihood, but there is an interrupted chain of passage here of intangible assets. So one thing to be noted is these mega projects are supported widely by private and public international actors. So the question I receive most of the time when I talk about my project is that how is this legal? Like, how is it legal to create such a massive mega project that exploits reserves, such massive mega project that exploits reserves of fossil fuels in 2020, when fossil fuels is mandatory to revert climate change? And also the experts, the IPCC and the environmental impact, the International Energy Agency have stated that there is no further resources should be extracted from the ground to stay within the objective of the Paris Agreement. So the question is, how is it possible? What rules may regulate, allow, or even protect such mega projects, especially because as they stand, they go counter the objective of the climate change international law regime. So my methodology, my research looks at the fossil fuel mega projects in Mozambique as a totem, and I conduct an analysis on the regulation of the coal, oil, and gas mega projects in the country. To do so, I adopt a transnational environmental law lens that allows me to go through different jurisdictional regulatory regimes on climate change and how they are intertwined with the regulation of these mega projects. And of course, I adopt varied methodology according to the area of the research, because I have three main areas of research. That's why it's mainly a transnational environmental lens. So the first is how international climate change obligation interact with national regulations of fossil fuels. The second one is on international investment law. And the third, last one on which I'm working at the moment is the role of aid in phasing out fossil fuels. So for the first part, international climate change law and national regulation of fossil fuels, I'm looking at the international obligation from climate change laid down in climate change law regimes and the national rules, and how they're implemented at national levels versus the regulation of the fossil fuel industry. So in this case, it is important also to note that, for example, the Paris Agreement nor any agreement within the climate change regime at the moment deals with fossil fuels. Although the science is clear, there is no agreement, international agreement at the moment that deals with that. Nonetheless, we've got Article 2 of the Paris Agreement that states that we should take necessary measure to stay within 2 degrees of warming and possibly 1.5. And the 2.c says that we must decarbonize financial flows. So when I compare the obligations under the the climate change obligations goals and the national regulation of fossil fuel mega projects, I mainly look at the national determined contributions, of course, the international law, national determined contributions, and I look at the national levels of law. And what is emerging is that there is a wide discrepancy between the mitigation objectives indicated in the determined contributions and the framework regulating the fossil fuel industry. Just to give you an idea, one of the objectives is to reduce the emissions by 40 million tons of CO2 equivalent between 2020 and 2025. But the Cabo Delgado project alone could emit between 3.3 and 4.5 billion tons of equivalent CO2 over the lifespan of 37 years. So if we run the maths, it's 90 million CO2 equivalent tons per year. And these results are preliminary and they need to be revised because, of course, in the meanwhile, the law has changed and new national determined contribution of 2021 was set. But in general, we have a clash with national law, especially when it creates special protection, establishes protected extractive enclaves like the Rovuma Basin special regime. And also there is no climate change impact assessment requested within the environmental law framework. This as well needs to be revised because there has been an update in the national law. The second part on international investment law looks at the conflicting objectives of investment protection and climate change goals. So the international investment law regime, which is set up through international investment agreements, national investment laws, and contracts, provisional contracts, grant foreign investors special economic protections. The thing is that any type of action that aims at pursuing climate change goals is most likely, not any, but it's most likely to curtail the profits of the fossil fuel industry because it will be aiming at phasing fossil fuels. And these measures are most likely, are very likely to amount to a breach of a state duty to protect investments. So one of the questions is, are these mega projects covered by investment protection? And the reality is yes, 24 out of 29 mega projects have direct access to investor-state dispute settlement system, which means that these foreign investors are able to sue the countries if it adopts any measure that could curtail their profit, not only climate measures, but really any measure that can cause loss of profit. On top of this, just the threat of having access to investor-state dispute can engender regulatory chill. Lastly, the part of my research, and as I said, I'm working on it, so this is still very raw, looks at aid in phasing out. What is the role of aid? So to understand the role of aid, I carry out comparative analysis based on a set of descriptive criteria. So first, I review the content of environmental guidelines and environmental impact assessment to see if they include climate change impact assessment. I look at the procurement procedures, so the bank's due diligence and the borrower's obligation. I then review the general climate change strategy and plan of the selected banks to see how they want to go about climate change. And lastly, I review Mozambique's country assistance framework and specific country plan to see if they include the development of such mega projects. I am looking at the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I might possibly, I still don't know, depend on the feasibility, because this research is harder than what I was expecting. Depending on feasibility, I might look at UK, Norway, and Sweden. Some of the preliminary results that are emerging is that there is no homogeneous practice. So we need a standardized climate change strategic impact assessment for the simple reason that it is, first of all, it can be globally applied and it's quantifiable. So usually environmental impact assessments are very dependent on local variables. In this case, we're talking about quantifiable emissions. So there is a need for standardized climate change strategic impact assessment integrated in the environmental impact assessment of public financial institutions. And this integration would also be extended beyond the aid to the bank's practice, for example, commercial loans, because commercial loans, UK and US have poured millions of dollars and pounds into the gas mega project as commercial loans to Mozambique, and actually the UK has been sued by an environmental NGO from Mozambique for pouring that money into this project. And also there is a need for a clear definition of climate objectives and strategy for what concerns the technical assistance. It's a very gray area. Lastly, and I finish here, what has emerged strongly is that the World Bank and African Development Bank still support the gas mega projects in Mozambique. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to continue this conversation.
Thank you very much, Lea. Thanks for your presentations. And now, last but certainly not least, protecting the past, preserving the future, protection of marine cultural heritage in Lamu Port, Kenya, by Joseph Omolo and Luciana Tuo from the Karabakh University of Kenya. They are both co-I of the research, researcher of the Rising from the Dead funded project, together with Daria.
Thank you very much, Anna Maria, and nice to see you again.
Likewise.
Given the short time that we have, I'll make the presentation, then Luciana could assist at the plenary stage to take some of the questions.
Joseph, please take your time to do the presentation. Don't shorten it. I mean, you have your full 15 minutes.
Thank you. It's a good thing to be the last person to present for today's session, because I'll be riding on the presentations that had been made earlier on by my colleagues, especially the one by Daria and the one by Joshua. So overall, the main objective of our research was to comparatively examine the socio-legal implications of two infrastructure projects that directly had an impact on marine cultural heritage of coastal areas in Kenya and Madagascar. Though in the course of running the project, we abandoned the Madagascan component because of logistical issues and mainly concentrated on the Lamu or the Kenyan element. And initially, the Lamu port and the Madagascan element, which was in relation to mining activities of a company known as QMM in Tolagnaro. These two sites had been selected because they have extensive underexploited marine cultural heritage, and both Lamu and Tolagnaro are located in fragile socio-political and economic environments within the Eastern Africa region. So we concentrated, as I mentioned, on the Lamu Port project, and I had prepared a presentation covering some background in relation to Lamu, but I don't see the point in going through that, given that my colleague Joshua had comprehensively taken us through that. I'll just mention some additional information in that regard. Of course, most of us are aware that Lamu is a UNESCO World Heritage site, and as such, it's protected under international law. And that The Indian Ocean is at the heart of cultural and economic activities in Lamu, because traditional fishing accounts for 75% of economic activities in Lamu, and other economic activities include boat building and weaving, which form part of Lamu's heritage. Lamu is located in the former coastal province in Kenya. This region had been characterized by the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission in 2013 as one of the regions that had been economically marginalized by deliberate state action by different regimes from pre-independence time. Lamu is also characterized by persistent terrorism threat from Al-Shabaab and other terror organizations, given its proximity to the Kenya-Somali border. In 2014, the state initiated a massive port development project, which is part of the corridor known as the Lamu Port, South Sudan, Ethiopia Transport Corridor, or LAPSET, which is a flagship project under Kenya's Vision 2030. Kenya's Vision 2030 is the economic blueprint that was meant to cover the period from the year 2003 to the year 2030. And it outlines a number of milestones that are essentially aimed at improving economic and social status of Kenya. The project spans 3 countries, that's Kenya, South Sudan, and Ethiopia, and it has got numerous components which include a seaport, so that's the Lamu seaport. There's a railway line, there's an oil pipeline and a refinery, there's a highway, international airport, resort cities, and other social amenities to support the other projects. The Lamu Port project specifically was designed to have 32 berths, which are to be located along a 6-kilometer strip of the Indian Ocean coastline. The 32 berths were supposed to be constructed in 2 phases. The initial phase was to be made up of 3 berths. Then the second phase was to be made up of 29 berths. The 3 berths which make up the first phase have already been completed. I think they were completed towards the end of 2020 or beginning of 2021. And that phase had been fully financed by the government of Kenya. Then phase 2, which is made up of the 29 berths, has not taken off effectively. And financing for the 29 berths was supposed to be sourced from the private sector. There has been some movement towards development of prospectus to attract investors, but nothing much has been reported so far. In 2018, there was a suit that was, sorry, I think slightly earlier, before 2018, a suit had been filed by a number of persons from Lamu with support of a number of civil society actors, challenging the constitutionality of the Lamu Port project in terms of how it was designed and implemented and the effect that it was likely to have on different stakeholders. Then in 2018, the High Court of Kenya declared the project unconstitutional for having not properly incorporated public participation. Its design and implementation was also viewed as breaching some environmental rights to access to information, right to culture, and it was also having negative impact on traditional fishing rights. So the High Court in 2018 declared it unconstitutional and instructed the government to rework the project so as to comply with different provisions of the Constitution. There was an appeal that was filed against that determination by the High Court, and that appeal is still pending determination before the Court of Appeal. But as the appeal was being filed, there was an application to stay execution of the determination of the High Court, which had declared the project unconstitutional and issued a permanent injunction against it. So the application for stay was granted, of course, made by the state, and that's how they were able to go ahead with the first phase of the project to conclusion. As I mentioned, that appeal is still pending determination before the Court of Appeal, and there is no clear indication on when that's likely to be concluded. Although I think the determination by the Court of Appeal is likely to be more relevant to the second phase, given that the first phase is generally complete. As Daria mentioned earlier on, we had field work where we met different stakeholders. We did have a meeting with civil society actors in Lamu and Nairobi. We also met a number of representatives from state organizations like the National Museums of Kenya and the county government of Lamu, Kenya National Commission for Human Rights. We also had meetings with community members to just get information from them on what they, on how they viewed the design and implementation of the project. We came up with a number of findings. I'll just highlight some of them, although Joshua had also mentioned some. Our first finding was that Kenya has got a very comprehensive legal and policy framework for the protection of environment. And this legal and policy framework is reflected both in the Constitution and in a number of legal instruments that clearly show the rights that people have in relation to the environment and the obligations that have been enforced upon the state to safeguard these rights. And in fact, the Constitution of Kenya has got a full chapter on protection of the environment and has got a number of obligations and standards that have got to be met in that regard. As Joshua mentioned, it's true that there was no effective participation and involvement of all relevant stakeholders in the design and implementation of the Lamu Port project. And that's why then the petition before the High Court was able to sail through on account of having not been designed and implemented according to the constitutional requirements. The third finding was that the state had failed to properly anticipate and put in place mitigation measures to safeguard the status of Lamu as a protected UNESCO World Heritage Site. And this became very clear from our conversation with the Kenya National Commission for UNESCO, which indicated that they had had some consultations with the state agency in charge of overseeing implementation of the port project. But somewhere along the line, those conversations seemed to have died. and the state then decided to proceed with the project without considering the other stakeholders. The fourth finding was that in certain instances, there would be divergence of interest amongst different stakeholders in relation to the Lamu Port project, and that the state was exploiting this by somehow meeting different stakeholders at different points in time and trying to compromise them in terms of convincing them to support the project as against other stakeholders, just as a way of weakening the combined advocacy initiative that had been mounted as against the project. The other finding was that community members from Lamu were very concerned that any economic opportunities that the port project was likely to bring about were likely to be hijacked by people who are not indigenous to Lamu. Remember, I mentioned that in 2013, the Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission had identified the coastal region where Lamu is located as one of those that had been historically marginalized. So development in Lamu is quite low. And Lamu also has another problem of low literacy levels. So the community members are very apprehensive that once the project has been fully operationalized, then the economic benefits are likely to be taken by people who they view as outsiders because they are not indigenous to Lamu. Again, from our discussion with different stakeholders, and I mentioned this already, that in certain instances there would be disharmony in terms of the interests that various stakeholders had. So some actually thought that the Lamu Port project carried a lot of promise in terms of the economic benefits that it's likely to bestow upon the residents of Lamu, which economic benefits they thought would actually outweigh the protection of the town's cultural heritage. I remember an example that was given that the whole world seemed to be very interested in convincing residents of Lamu to continue practicing traditional fishing practices and boat building using wood, when traditional fishing practices could only be done at small scale level and was sort of continuing poverty within Lamu, and that boat building using wood had become uneconomical because already there were many other agencies or entities that had set up factories that make boats from I'm forgetting the material, from fiberglass, which are much cheaper and easier to build and last longer compared to boats built from wood. So there was a concern that while they appreciate the cultural heritage of Lamu as a city, their concern was that then that protection should not be done at the cost of the economic progress of Lamu people. Again, another finding was that in designing and implementing the project, the state seemed not to have properly considered adverse effects that the project could have on vulnerable groups like women. And as such, it did not put any mitigational efforts, particularly targeting these vulnerable groups. And any mitigational efforts that had been put in place seemed to target the community in general without being sensitive to these vulnerabilities. Finally, the policy of the state in relation to the design and implementation of the project seemed not to be very clear on how it would encourage incorporation of local content, either in terms of ensuring that in implementing the project, some materials would have to be procured from the local community. It also didn't seem to have a very clear guideline or policy on how local communities could be involved in the project in terms of employment and capacity building in various sectors. It was also not clear on what benefit sharing arrangements it would have with the local community. And in fact, this became very clear from our conversation with officials from Lamu County government. With that, I would want to hand over to Anna Maria. That should be the end of my presentation.
Thank you.
Anna, you're muted.
Sorry. I thought it was quite amazing that I hadn't done it yet, but of course I've done it. But anyway, thank you so much, Joseph. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for the project, for the way you have engaged, you and Luciana and Daria have engaged with the project, because I think, and I can't stress this enough, it's important for us lawyers to engage with the community, to understand what the community need and want, and we need to hear the voices of the community, and we need then to be and we need these voices to be heard by lawyers, and I really cannot emphasize this enough. And you know, it struck me as well that what you say, we hear about mitigation measure all the time, especially within the business and human rights discourse. And then too often it happens that these mitigation measures are general measures that have been put in place rather than targeting the community specifically. And we hear within the development discourse the rhetoric of the one size does not fit all. And now everybody, every international organization says it, but they're actually doing absolutely nothing to make sure that this is the case. And so these projects are a concrete example of how we can ensure that development is specific, is targeted, that the communities are listened to. And even if it's only 1 or 2 projects that we've managed to finance, and that, you know, actually it's more than that, because today we've already heard 5 people talking about this and taking a very, very direct and straightforward and specific approach to community engagement and to the case study and to the countries that are notoriously marginalized and not heard. Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya. So I think that this is already a very important step towards the right direction, and that Rising from the Dead has made in this respect. And you know, we're now at 4:40, and we are nearing to the final remarks and the conclusion. So I think that we could maybe join the final remarks and the discussion, the questions that we have for the 3 of you all together, if you like. So is there anyone has got any question for our 3 speakers in this second part of the workshop? please feel free to raise your hand or putting questions in the chat if you like.
Hello, Anna, can you hear me?
Yes, Arturo, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the three presentations. They've been very interesting. I was especially interested in the last one, the one about the port of Lamu, also link a bit to the presentation that Daria did in the first session this morning. And I was interested because, I mean, I've been following a bit all the different World Heritage Committee decisions on Lamu, not during the last years, and they've been quite strong decisions, and especially there was a reactive monitoring mission to Lamu that also recommended creating different specific actions, like for instance, the establishment of an heritage task team, a community forum in Lamu Island linked to the LAMSET project, and also a corporate social responsibility program. And these decisions are pushing Kenya to send a report to the World Heritage Committee by 1st of February 2022. So I was wondering if any of you who has been following a bit all this case sees any progress from the part of the State Party or the integration also of national missions of Kenya in all the project itself. So I was wondering that. Thank you. Maybe Joseph can maybe reply if not. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Joseph, you can reply straight away if you want.
From our conversation with the UNESCO Commission, which I was in 2020/2021, I think most of those initiatives had been undermined by COVID. At least that's the response that we got from the UNESCO Commission. And I actually think that as at the time when we were meeting the UNESCO Commission, there is a visit that had been planned to Lamu, which didn't take place. I'm not sure whether it took place ultimately, but as at 2021, it was planned and it didn't take place.
Thank you. No, I was just looking at the committee decision from the World Heritage Committee in 2021 in July, and apparently, I mean, they are thanking the State Party for the reactive monitoring mission. So probably the visit took place. It's only that, I mean, the actions because of COVID or the different management or political decisions haven't been implemented, those decisions. So I guess, I mean, it's a matter of seeing if eventually something is happening in that sense, no? Integrating heritage, integrating communities, having a corporate social responsibility program. Those would be very interesting to see how develop.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Arturo. Is there any other questions for any one of our speakers? No?
Sorry, I was trying to find out how to put my my thing up. I couldn't put my hand up for some reason. I don't know why it's not going up. But put my hand up. Yes. Can I just ask Joseph a really quick question, just about Lamu itself and going there? Do you get an impression? What do the local community think of the World Heritage designation? Never mind the LAPSET stuff that's happened. When the World Heritage designation happened, was that a positive thing for Lamu?
Yes, it was. And I think usually there is a Lamu Cultural Week in February of every year, I think maybe towards the end of February. So yes, that really boosted economic activities a lot in Lamu, because Lamu's economy also depends significantly on tourism. So people were happy about that.
I had heard that when the World Heritage Tourism designation went in, a lot of the local people sold properties because they were getting offered a lot of money by companies because it became a more important tourist destination. And that created problems in terms of the cultural identity of the place, because a lot of the local people moved further inland. And it also created problems in terms of water supply. I'm just wondering, you know, in some ways the designation changed the very nature of the thing it was protecting.
Yes, I think it must have, because as I mentioned earlier on, Lamu had been the part of the country where nobody seemed to have had an interest in at all. Then we now have it being designated as World Heritage Site by UNESCO. Then you also have these other development projects being initiated, and people in Lamu are wondering, then why is the interest now starting to rise in Lamu? So yes, there's that concern that outsiders seem to be coming in to displace the indigenous people. And remember, also mentioned that for that the other problem that Lamu has is low literacy levels. So that most of these economic activities, either rising from designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which promotes more tourism, or the implementation of the port project and related projects, there's a high risk that the economic benefits will then be taken over by non-locals. And I actually think that from our discussion, and Luciana could correct me if I'm wrong on this, when we visited the Kenya Ports Authority, I think there was an indication that they had difficulties getting local people to take part in technical aspects of the project. That most members of the local community could only take part in the low-level jobs. I think that was the impression, Luciana, that we got.
Absolutely. Two things came up from that discussion at KPA and also at the county government. So the first is, of course, the county government was left out altogether. The county government would better know the people in the county and what their needs were. The county government is not involved at all in the implementation of the project or even in its design. And so the interests of the people never get factored in at all at any stage of the process. But secondly, as Joseph has said, Lamu is a very traditionally Islamic region, and therefore literacy levels have never been very important to the people as long as they can get their sustenance from the ocean. So whether with the basket weaving or the fishing, that has been the focus. There has been some people who do farming, but a lot of the land has also been taken over for the project and related activities, and people sold their lands to the government happily to get money immediately. So the other thing that also came out is the gender component of the impact of the project, where because Islamic culture doesn't allow women to own property, where men sold property to the government, the women were left impoverished, so they have no money to educate their children. Many men sold property and moved to other parts of the country, so women are left in the town to raise children. They don't have money to raise children with. And so you have this idea of poverty also becoming cyclic because their children are not educated enough to take advantage of any opportunities, and they don't have hope of taking advantage of those opportunities in the future. The government had promised some capacity building projects for the project, but they were focused on the technical aspects of the project long term. Many of those technical capacity building sessions never actually took place. So even what the government has been saying they will do to strengthen the local community is not happening. There's no follow through on it. And because the county government is not involved, no one gets to push the agenda of the local community. So just as Joseph is saying, the danger is that the local communities will not keep their cultural heritage. They'll give it up because it's more economically viable to go work with bigger fishing boats. But also in the long run, even if the project gets implemented, they don't get to enjoy the benefits of the project. Other people from other parts of the country or people who have bought property get to enjoy the tourism and other elements.
Yeah,
that's sorry.
Yes, and in fact, while if you look at, for example, the case that had gone to the High Court, I mean, the case is based on high-sounding doctrinal issues. People are interested in protection of culture. People are interested in protection of the environment and upholding of the requirement of public participation. But from the discussion that we had with most correspondents, especially community members, it was very clear that in reality, people were not committed to those high-sounding doctrinal issues. People were mainly concerned about economic inclusion. So that if the government figured out how to include all of them in terms of the economic benefits, then maybe nobody would be talking about cultural heritage or protection of the environment anymore.
I'm wondering as well, it's really interesting what you're saying. I'm just wondering, I don't know if you touched on this in the talk, about the follow through of what the government's done, because it's amazing that there was a High Court ruling and there was an agreement to pay $17.5 million to 4,600 fishermen in Lamu for the loss of livelihood caused by the port development work. But I wonder, has that money ever been paid?
No, it has not been paid. I think 3 months ago, I must have come across a news item indicating that there were some negotiations between the fishermen and the government, but I don't think that ultimately went through, or it's still, maybe it's still in the pipeline. But of course, remember that the state appealed against the determination by the High Court, and it secured a temporary stay of the execution. So as at now, it means that the status in which we are is the status that existed before the High Court made the determination. But yes, there has been some effort towards trying to settle the matter out of court, but I don't think that has worked out. Interestingly, from again our discussion with the beach management unit in Lamu, which is the one in charge of the welfare of fishermen and people within the fisheries industry, there's a lot of controversy in relation to the question of compensation. There are people who are alleging that the state had identified around 4,700 fishermen. Some of these people allegedly are actually not even fishermen. And most of them are members of the beach management unit. And that beach management unit is made up of members who come from very many sectors, some of which are not even directly related to the fishing industry. So that in reality, even if the government were to make that money available today, already there would be disagreements on how is it supposed to be shared and who genuinely qualifies to be compensated from that money. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omolo. I can see that Leah has raised her hand and is threatening to talk. So I hand it over to Leah.
Yeah. Hi, on this topic, it's really interesting because there are very similar documented aspects in Mozambique, of course, around the mega projects area. And what I wanted to say is that when you look at the regulations, so for example, the resettlement and all of these aspects that without even considering inclusive economic growth, I'll say a little bit about this after with the project, is you have all those resettlement projects which sometimes the process sometimes might be encoded in the law, but the reality is most of it is left to voluntary commitment or corporate social responsibility from the how to do it. So it is mandatory, but how it is developed then is down to people, to even the companies. Even in some areas in Mozambique where there is polygamy, they have resettled the families and they have separated them because they only considered one man and one woman. So the mess that was there and infringements of human rights that have happened in that area are enormous, because you have the problem is really within the codification of the law, from what I could see, because in the normative in Mozambique, you have it, but then it's like, and I can tell you that some companies that are investing in Mozambique have said, oh yeah, we'll do this fantastic project, and the population is going to gain from it, and we're going to do the resettlement practice and stuff, and sometimes they pay some sort of NGO on the side to do some work, but the end result is it never gets to the people. It's like the money for the resettlement, has it ever really come through to the people? And then there's the other thing, which is the inclusion of the local population. So when you have all these programs, they have to integrate the local population, and that is really why there is a civil war in northern Mozambique. It's like you have extreme poverty, extreme disengagement with the local population from the government, and then you've got the sharks, the mega fossil fuel company that arrive and say, okay, now we're going to make billions out of your land, out of everything, and we're going to include you. But the idea of inclusion, although it states you have to include local population, it's so badly articulated that the end result is that you've got a legislation that creates an extractive enclave that is made for basically white skilled people that arrive there to take all the money from and to work for these projects. So really down to the letter of the law, it's very important to see. I mean, I can see how many discrepancies there are in between what is actually supposed to be and what is written in black letters. And especially the thing is the difference in between what is voluntary, so defined by the companies, and what is actually the law, what is actually mandatory. On this, there are many discrepancies, at least in Mozambique.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting in terms of what you were talking about, you know, the law and what actually happens on the ground, because one of the things you were talking about was, you know, environmental impact assessments and that they should be taking account of cultural rights. The High Court ruling by LAMU is the government admitting that they should have done that. And actually in the ruling itself, it said there should have been a proper environmental impact assessment that talked to the community. So they're actually admitting that that's something that should have happened. Now, the interesting thing is, after that award of money, there went all around the world that natural justice had prevailed. But of course, they've never actually been paid. So it's one thing having it even admitted by a national court, or whether it's actually even going to happen. But one thing I think is quite interesting about it is, for the developer, it sends a message that they could have saved money in litigation and holdups if they'd actually had a proper consultation before they did it. So we have to get this idea across to developers that it's in their interests to have that consultation.
I don't know on that, because in the money, like at least for this extractive process, the consultation sometimes can take up more money than the compensation they might be giving, if they give it, because they know very well. And
that's the argument that they use in developer archaeology in the UK, but it may not well work in that context. Yeah.
John, I admire your optimism.
I think is the word.
Can I say the fee in the UK might be much higher, and that's why contestation in the UK might be seen as something really that people want to avoid, because going to court in the UK is prohibitive.
No, but the LAMU one's interesting because it happened. It went to court and they were awarded this money, and it's just whether that's ever paid or not is the question.
Yeah, but
John, I can assure you that even if the Court of Appeal goes ahead to uphold the determination by the High Court nullifying the port project, the government might just go ahead and ignore it anyway, or it might file an appeal to the Supreme Court. And remember, this determination was made in 2018. We are in 2022. The Court of Appeal has not made a determination. Phase 1 is complete already. So by the time the Court of Appeal makes a determination, maybe phase 2 would have taken off. If it affirms the determination by the High Court, the state might either ignore or file an appeal to the Supreme Court, which might again take some time. So we could be looking at a determination maybe in 2027. If that goes against the state, I'm assuming by then, maybe phase 2 would have been 50% done. They would either ignore or they'll find a way of applying for review of the Supreme Court determination. So I'm not really excited about the fact that the court made that determination. I know that the state could figure out other ways to still bulldoze their way through. But at least, yes, it was a good statement.
I agree with that. I mean, I don't, that's why I asked if the money's been paid. I don't think it ever will be, but it's interesting that they've had to admit it in a high court ruling, that if you look at the ruling itself, it's actually quite damning. And that exists now, and it's something to build upon. But it does just make me think about law and how effective things are. And you can sign up even to things like the 2001 convention we were talking about earlier. A state has an obligation to do the stuff in the 2001 to follow these rules, but they don't necessarily do it. It's difficult to actually police that stuff. And it just comes back to the fact that the only people that get rich are the lawyers. And I want to leave you with that idea. Because it's
no, we cannot possibly leave it on that.
I'm not wrapping up. It's just I have to go to another meeting.
Arturo, you should have given me the power to control the meeting so that I would mute him. Because we cannot possibly close the meeting on that note. Ciao, John. You'll watch the recording for the final close. I'll make you watch the recording for the final. No, let's not really absolutely finish the meeting on that note. I refuse, because we need to find us lawyer. We need to find some usefulness to the law. Because think if we didn't even have the law, we can think about reforming the system. We can definitely talk about ways of reforming the system. And if anything, the case is important because it. You know, it entrenches, it shows the importance of the obligation, it entrenches it. And I think especially when then we come back to the funder, and if we look at whether the World Bank would ever fund a project again that would bring such a stigma to the project, you know, that's why it's so important to raise awareness. I mean, I know that they would, but they shouldn't. And we need to raise our voices to ensure that they won't again. So we need to raise awareness. And, you know, anyway, we can only be hopeful that that it will. I mean, I was about to start a long conversation on why the law is important, but I realized that it's 5 minutes past 5, so we'll leave that for we leave that for year 1 of undergraduate studies in law. And I just want to thank everyone for participating, for such intense discussion and very compelling presentations. I think you've all made your case quite well. And yes, absolutely, a virtual clap to everyone. I truly enjoyed it, and I'm sorry we have overrun by a few minutes, but I hope you know, you have enjoyed it as much as me. And thank you very much to our speakers, to the contributors, to the participants, to the questions, to John for setting the network in the first instance. And because without the projects, without the money for funding the projects, we wouldn't have had any of this. So thank you very much, everyone. And let's keep in touch and speak very soon. Bye-bye, everyone.